Hello, everybody. For those that are here for the event on the impact of crime on critical material supply chains for the green energy transition, we are about to start, so I would ask you to come and join us. So, yeah. Yeah. Well, hello everybody then, again. And thank you so much for joining us at this event today, which is about the impact of crime on critical material supply chains for the green energy transition. I would like to first call on our co-organizers, Eric Ruiz-Araya, Deputy Director, Project Facilitating and Support Division from IRENA, to give us some welcome words.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Eric Ruiz-Araya. I am working in IRENA as the Deputy Director for the Project Facilitation and Support Division. So I want to thank you all for being here and also for UNOCD for organizing this event, also inviting us to take part of it. So in behalf of our Director General that couldn't make it, because as you can imagine, we're also all running around, just allow me to introduce the event and just set the stage to what is to come. So you will hear a great deal at this COP about the urgent need to triple the deployment of renewable energies by 2030, something that we as IRENA have been talking about and trying to establish that in our minds clearly. It is an ambitious target that we need to achieve, along with doubling energy efficiency, and it's vital we have any chance of remaining on a viable path to limit our global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. It goes without saying that a rapid and just energy transition is at the center of climate change. It is at the heart of our country's NDCs and long-term strategies to meet the global climate goals of the Paris Agreement. Here at COP, we see the conclusion of the first global stocktake, which will be clarion call for acceleration action. But it is becoming increasingly clear that the supply of and demand of critical raw materials, which are the building blocks of the energy transition, may not always be aligned. The mining and processing of critical materials are highly concentrated geographically, creating vulnerabilities and uncertainties for both consuming and producing countries that may affect the deployment, cost, sustainability of the energy transition technologies. Earlier this year, we as IRENA released the report on the role of critical materials in geopolitics of the energy transition, studying the significance of the global energy transition and the association of the geopolitical implications. We found that there is no scarcity of reserves of these materials. Its limitations in capacity for mining and refining are what is the cause of concern. The good news is that worldwide shortfall of any one mineral will delay the energy transition, and the strategies to diversify supply and production chains are starting to emerge. Production has surged for many energy transition minerals, and reserves mining from economically viable solutions have grown. Efficiency improvements and material substitutions are also reshaping the demand. With regard to geopolitics, only a handful of countries play a dominant role in providing critical materials. Key mining countries include Australia for lithium, Chile for copper and lithium, China for graphite and rare earth, the Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt, Indonesia for nickel, and South Africa for platinum and iridium. But when it comes to processing, even fewer countries are holding the cards. China, for example, currently holds and accounts for 100% of the refinement supply of natural graphite and dysprosium, 70% of cobalt, and almost 60% of lithium and manganese. These patterns of production and processing are not likely to change in the coming years, making international cooperation paramount in developing policies which can accelerate the global transition. There is another dimension, however, often overlooked, and that is the high social cost in meeting the global demand of critical materials. There are well-known concerns about the environmental and health impacts of extracting, processing, and distributing these materials. Moreover, the energy transition can and not and should not come at the cost of higher levels of air, water, and land pollution, which will potentially impact vulnerable communities in particular. But there are also logistical and financial challenges, compounded by challenges in the traceability of critical materials that increase the risk of critical networks getting involved. That is why the conversation we are having here today is so important. And I hope we can leave the discussion with a clear sense of commitment in two major points. Number one, we must work towards the development of transparent markets with coherent standards and norms grounded in human rights, environmental stewardship, and community engagement throughout the entire value supply chain of critical materials. Diversifying resources is essential, but we must not lose sight of the potential for harmful impact on people and nature. Second, we must consider how to redesign value chain to ensure they are inclusive, ethical, and sustainable. This may require not only identify the specific vulnerabilities along the value chain, but also the measures that can be put in place to reduce these vulnerabilities, aiming at preventing and addressing crime. I look forward to working with you and a plan action for address this concern. I look forward for the panel and the discussions that we have ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now to talk us a little bit on setting up the scene of the situation of the situation, especially of the vulnerabilities in the value chain. We have Sebastian Sala, who is policy manager at the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, who will be presenting using the slides that you see there.
Great, thank you very much. And we're really thrilled to have the chance to be here today to talk about this topic, which is very close to the EITI's heart. And so we're thrilled to see that it's made it onto the agenda at COP and that UNODC and IRENA are paying attention to this really important issue. So I'll give some brief scene setting, presentation. As we just heard, there's clearly an important role for the mining sector in the energy transition. But we're faced with a bit of a dilemma in that we need to increase the supply of minerals used in low-carbon technologies, but we need to do that in a way that respects the rights of stakeholders in minerals-producing countries. And issues of crime, and what I'll focus on particularly corruption, are really major obstacles to achieving both of those objectives. And what I'll do with this presentation is just start off by talking through some of the demand projections that are out there for the minerals sector, then describe what that growing demand might mean for corruption risks and what the implications of those corruption risks are, both for the rights of stakeholders and for our ability to scale up renewables, and then describe some of the tools that we have for tackling those risks. So if I could ask Niels to move us along one more slide. Great, thank you. So I think there's a growing recognition that the technologies underpinning the energy transition are very minerals intensive. The IEA issued a report a couple of years ago in which they estimated that in order for us to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, we would need to increase the supply of minerals used in low carbon technologies fourfold. And to illustrate this a little bit more, the IEA estimates that your average electric car uses approximately 6 times as many minerals as a conventional internal combustion engine car. And they estimate that a wind farm uses around 9 times the amount of minerals as an equivalent sized gas power plant. So there's clearly a message here around we're going to need mining in order to meet the goals of the energy transition, and the more ambitious we want to be in our decarbonization objectives, the more mining we will need. You can have the next slide. There are certain minerals which are anticipated to see particularly strong demand growth. I would, however, urge a little bit of caution around applying too much confidence in sort of the specific predictions for individual minerals, because things like technological innovations, but also geopolitical shifts, can really dramatically change the demand outlook for a mineral. But for the mining sector as a whole, I think we can say with pretty strong confidence that we're entering into a phase that will see strong demand growth. Niels, if we could have the next slide. And so what does that demand growth mean? Well, on the one hand, there's definitely an opportunity here. So for minerals producing countries, there's an opportunity to attract new investment, to generate new jobs, new government revenues, to develop infrastructure, to develop downstream industries. But if we look at the track record of the mining sector historically, we can also see that whenever there are mineral booms, there are also some pretty serious challenges that come with those. And one of those challenges that we see repeating time and again is the risk of corruption increasing as prices go up. And the implications of that corruption really go from the very local level to the global level. The logic behind why a mining boom might result in more corruption is pretty simple. It's that as prices go up, the potential rewards from engaging in corruption are bigger, and as a result, the incentives to engage in corrupt behavior also go up. One of the areas that at the EITI we're particularly concerned about is corruption that can occur when governments issue licenses to mining companies to give them the rights to mine. There we see a risk of bribery being used to influence decision making. We also see the risk of favoritism with, for instance, politically connected companies being treated differently to other companies in the sector. And that issue, we are concerned, might be exacerbated going forward as lots of countries are thinking about, well, how could we speed up processes for issuing mining licenses? And those types of efforts to speed up licensing aren't necessarily a bad thing, but we just need to make sure that as that happens, we maintain strong safeguards against corruption. And one of the key messages that we want to convey is that corruption isn't some sort of abstract issue, but it really has direct implications on people's lives. As I said, and those implications really go from the very local to the global. At the local level, corruption increases the risk of violations of community rights, it increases the risk of environmental harm, especially if it results in mining moving into areas that are particularly environmentally and socially sensitive, and there potentially being shortcuts in things like environmental and social impact assessments or community consultation processes. But then all of this also has a global dimension. Corruption is bad for business, it harms the investment climate, it can make it harder it can undermine the trust between governments, companies, and communities, which in turn can make it harder for companies to maintain their social license to operate. All of that potentially resulting in supply disruptions, which impact downstream companies and potentially has an implication for our ability to scale up renewables investments at the speed that we really need in order to tackle climate change. But there are some solutions to this challenge. Just very quickly, actually, this is, if we could go to that map on the next slide. This is just from a report that we published last year to illustrate some of these environmental and social sensitivities. So we looked at transition mineral projects in EITI countries and found that nearly half of them are located on or near environmental conservation areas. And if we could go to the next slide, that shows that around 80% are located on or near the lands of indigenous peoples or other land-connected peoples. So that's just to illustrate that there are some quite important environmental and social sensitivities that we need to be thinking about as we try to grow the sector. So how can we address these risks? Well, at the EITI, we think that there is an urgent need for collective action on corruption risks in mineral supply chains. Some of the ways of tackling those risks include having strong commitments to identifying and mitigating corruption risks, having strong environmental and social safeguards, and then the sort of bread and butter of the EITI, having strong commitments to transparency. And if we can move to the next slide. So the EITI, we're implemented in nearly 60 countries around the world. And through the EITI, governments and companies commit to disclosing information about their mining sectors to the public. And then in addition to the countries that implement the EITI, we have a set of supporting companies, which includes many of the largest mining and energy companies in the world, and also many of the most influential civil society organizations active in the sector. And so there's a kind of a multi-stakeholder effort to strengthen transparency in the extractive industries. And if we could have the next slide. And the way in which the EITI works is essentially to require information disclosures all across the value chain of the mining sector, from the licensing and contracting in the mining sector, to information on the owners of companies operating in the sector, to information on taxes, as well as on environmental and social impacts. And we really see that as one of the key tools for getting from having these natural resources to achieving our objectives of both benefiting stakeholders in minerals producing countries and ensuring we have enough mineral supplies to deliver on our objectives of the energy transition. So I'll leave it there and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, and it's important to remember these risks and the ways in which we can address corruption. But the whole, and this helps us to address the demand issues, but also some of the supply issues. But I think our next speaker, Mr. Alan Cole, who is Chief of the Border Management Branch at UNODC, will tell us a bit more also about other risks, including in the supply chain. So over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much indeed, Annie. Is that better? No, nothing happened. Thank you very much. Sorry, the delay has now put pressure on me to say something worth listening to, hasn't it? So there we go. Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations to Sebastian for the great research. It's really useful and it really informs what we're doing, and it's great to be here with IRENA today, partnering on this event. I think it's a very positive development. I look after UNODC's border management work, and that means that we have a team of people around the world working on various border management issues. So we have, in around 100 countries, we have people in ports and airports and coast guard stations and working in forests and jungles on environmental crime work and in courtrooms and so on. And what we're really trying to come to terms with at UNODC in the environmental team is how we bring all that expertise and all those people we have to bear on this particular issue, because we're very much at the beginning of our time working on it. And we know some things, though, from our experience. And one is that when you have a phenomenon like this, which is very high profits and a very low risk of prosecution and a shaky legal framework, you have an opportunity for organised crime groups. So we know that. And we also know these organised crime groups. These are not going to be new groups that are recruited through headhunters and recruitment companies. These are existing organised crime groups that are already starting to move into this area. So we know that in Latin America, for example, there's a strong correlation between organised crime groups involved in this sort of business and those that are involved in drugs. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, there's a correlation. And then in Africa, we would see links between the organised crime groups involved in this business and those in trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. So UNODC already knows the sorts of people, and in some cases the actual people who are moving into this work. And what we have to do is to work with industry to see how we can make it more difficult for them to transition into those areas. And on Sebastian's last slide, he put up some notes around the requirements for export regulation and revenue collection and legal framework. And not coincidentally, those are exactly the areas that we work in. So we look at legal framework, albeit on the criminal justice side, and we look at export control in that we work in container ports and airports and out at sea in shipping, and also revenue collection, because we're about trying to provide a light touch criminal justice solution to allow for trade to happen. I doubt this microphone would work without some rare minerals. So we're not saying that these should be banned, as we might do if we were having this discussion about heroin. We're not saying this is an exercise in banning things. This is an exercise in working out how industry can go about what it needs to do without making the lives of millions of people a misery. There are two examples we can look at that I thought would be of interest. One is Zimbabwe, where we see, and I'm sure this is, I'm drawing on your work here, we see the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association talking about abuse in the lithium business, about child labour, gender-based violence, illegal land clearance going on. We see an investigation from Al Jazeera into very high rates of corruption, including in the management of the trade body in Zimbabwe. And trafficking in persons and gender-based violence and child labour are all things that UNODC has got a lot to say about, and a lot that we can do about it as well. And then when we go to another example, Myanmar, particularly challenging, this one, where we're talking about rare earth elements. We see huge environmental impact in terms of chemicals getting into the water. And in that particular circumstance, we know from our work on the heroin trade in the Golden Triangle that these are areas that aren't controlled by any government, certainly not the Myanmar government, with strong influence from across the border in China, very, very well entrenched organised crime groups. And we now need to see how we can bring all the lessons that UNODC's learnt in the Golden Triangle on working on the heroin trade to onto this issue. So I'd never even heard of dysprosium and terbium before I agreed to do this panel discussion, but it's every day's an education in the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So we know that in this particular circumstance we have the engagements of militias, child labour, and particularly these leaching techniques of stripping the landscape completely bare of vegetation and injecting ammonium bicarbonate and so on, which then gets into the water system. Now that is bad in itself, but again we know from our experience in illegal fishing and illegal logging that if we do this sort of work, we will displace communities, they will leave, they can no longer make a legitimate living, they will make an illegitimate living. So UNODC can help there too. In terms of what we do about it, in some places where there's a rule of law framework in place, we can do stuff on legislative drafting, we can do stuff with prosecutors and police officers, just like we do on rhino tusk or fish or drugs or whatever it is. And these 100 experts in 100 plus countries I spoke about are the people who can be set to work on this. They're not that busy. We can give them another job to do. They won't mind. We're here on a Sunday. They can work more hours as well. But also, if we can't, in somewhere like the situation in Myanmar where we can't necessarily work in those areas safely, then a lot of this stuff has to be exported. The markets are not in Myanmar. And then the experts we have out in the maritime crime program, boarding ships at sea, seeing what they're moving around, and the experts we have in ports and airports can be brought to bear on the problem. So we talked about, the IRENA opener talked about the need for a strong commitment on this, but you can please be reassured that UNODC is completely committed to working in this area. We're completely committed to our partners in IRENA, and we are very interested to hear what the other speakers have to say. Thank you, Hani.
Thank you so much. And indeed, the issue is becoming a bit clearer in terms of how we have areas that need conservation, indigenous communities in the same areas where these critical minerals exist, where we have risks on corruption, but also risks in terms of the governance of these areas and the possibilities that we have for prevention and the lessons we have to learn on current illegal mining. So perhaps I want to invite now Ms. Maya Devive, Senior Vice President and Head of Statkraft Sustainability Governance and Compliance Unit. I think you may tell us a little bit more about how we can do some prevention work downstream, especially with businesses. So over to you, Maya. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks for the great introduction so far. I think set the scene really well in terms of the challenge. So I work at Statkraft, which is not a very well-known name, but we are in fact Europe's largest producer of renewable energy. It's headquartered in Oslo, but we have renewable energy operations across 20 countries around the world. In addition to having hydro, wind and solar, we also work on new energy development, hydrogen, battery, etc. We've just launched a new exponential growth strategy where we will be completing a new power plant every 9 days in 2025, and we'll be doubling our portfolio every 5 years. So we are a big part of the solution in terms of generating new renewable energy assets across the world, which, as we, I think, can all agree, is an important part of the solution to the climate crisis. But with every solution comes a set of challenges. And we've been concerned for some time around the topics of corruption, money laundering, tax evasion risks. I think we've seen historically that with every resource boom, as investment flows start to redirect into a new sector, and we're really at the beginning of that hockey stick when it comes to renewable energy, it drags with it the problems of the past. And as a developer and builder of renewable energy assets across the world, we see these problems occurring, unfortunately, right across geographies where we operate. They are problems, as Seb described, very similar to those experienced in oil, gas and mining. There are problems around licensing, permitting processes, problems related to community involvement, community engagement, problems related to overall tax regimes and subsidy regimes. And unfortunately, quite a lot of these problems are transnational in nature, so they're difficult to tackle by a single government or a single company. Now, those are problems that we face directly as a renewable energy developer. But I think a challenge that has yet to be fully appreciated by the renewable energy sector and companies downstream like us are the risks around transition minerals and the transition mineral supply chain. And I'm almost a bit surprised that the actors downstream have so far not been put under more pressure when it comes to this topic, because the problems are very well known and they're very well documented, and every single actor downstream like us cannot avoid a part of supply from that supply chain. It is yet not very diversified, as we know, and I think Seb mentioned some of the statistics around this picture. And I think the challenge, I'd like to lift 3 challenges that we see as a downstream actor when it comes to tackling these problems. I think the first is we you might be aware of and familiar with the OECD due diligence framework on conflict and transitional minerals. They've also done quite a lot of interesting research over the last couple of years looking at how well are companies downstream doing in terms of adopting this framework and adhering to it. And what the analysis shows is that companies are getting increasingly better at mapping the risks. So you have fairly good standards set by the largest players downstream, and ours would be no different there in terms of mapping and documenting risks. But when it comes to actually tackling them, there is a substantial challenge for downstream companies. And if I were to put it very simply, the majority of companies downstream are attempting to tackle this challenge basically through a cascading of contractual terms. And that cascading of contractual terms and contractual obligations has to make its way down 7, 8 layers of a supply chain. So we have a lot of engagement with the first line suppliers, our turbine manufacturers, our solar panel manufacturers, and we impose expectations and requirements on them. But they sit far away from the problem. They sit another 6, 7 steps away from the problem themselves. So this sort of legalistic, formalistic reliance upon contractual terms as a way of managing risks, I think is fairly quickly becoming clear to companies that this is not going to cut it in terms of addressing the risks. And that brings me to the second problem. The entry points then for action are not that many when you look at downstream companies. So the way in which you try to tackle problems that development agencies have tried to tackle for several decades. And you're talking about entrenched governance problems in fragile environments where we know, based on experience, that the only thing that will have an effect are long-term, well-developed strategies involving multiple stakeholders from both civil society, government, and business that's a complicated task. It's very difficult to achieve, and it's certainly very difficult to achieve if you're a downstream buyer 7, 8 steps away from the problem. So I think the experience that we're having as a company is that you cannot attempt at handling this risk as an individual company alone. It has to be done through partnerships across the sector, where you join up forces with the other large buyers to then collaborate with the key suppliers in the supply chain, rather than this sort of formalistic imposing of requirements on them. And we were part of launching one such initiative with the Solar Europe Stewardship initiative that works across 50 companies at different stages of the supply chain to look at sustainability, human rights and compliance-related risks in the PV supply chain. And that is one such attempt at looking at how can we collaborate across a wider supply chain to address these challenges. And I think the third challenge or risk that I'd like to raise is that when it comes to then making actual progress on the ground, the efforts that are needed, and you mentioned some of the efforts, but it's really such a complex set of interventions that are required if you want to try and tackle entrenched problems of this kind. So I think for us we need to have a much stronger focus as a sector on this cross-section of challenges around corruption, tax evasion, etc. And we happen to be at COP together with the ITI and another group of stakeholders launching a call to action to government, civil society and businesses alike to try and lift this discussion within the renewable energy sector. I think we've had quite a lot of good focus specifically on human rights challenges. There's an increasingly strong focus on the impact on nature and biodiversity and the challenges around that. But the good old-fashioned traditional resource cost challenges of corruption and tax evasion and the crime that is associated with that has so far received very little attention. And we've seen over the years that we've been collaborating on the call to action that when you look across different policy platforms, this subject rarely pops up as a focus of attention. So we're hoping that with the efforts of UNODC and EITI and others, that this might be changing. So I think I'll leave it there and come back in with some further points afterwards in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maya. And indeed, the challenges are extremely complex, and perhaps if I may add my own element there, that's why we need to start thinking also on how to pace this demand and the supply so that we can grow in a way that is sustainable and doesn't add to pollution, doesn't add on pressure on human rights, especially looking at the distribution that Sebastian presents. I would like to now call on our last speaker, Mr. John Lindberg, Policy and Public Affairs Lead from the International Council on Mining and Metals, who will hopefully add also to some ideas on how to manage the risks that we have ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and absolutely delighted to both be on this panel, but more importantly, the fact this topic is yet again back on the menu card, because I think it is crucial to recognize, if we step back, and Sebastian has once again done my job for me in setting the stage, that it is so clear that we will need to mine a lot more. We're not going to get away from that fact. And as soon as you get a boom, there is always a lot of people wanting to come in and make a quick profit. And again, this is a story as old as time, and previous speakers has mentioned that. And I think from the mining sector's perspective, this is nothing new. This is a reality that we've been facing for a very long period of time. And as I normally like to do when we talk about these matters around corruption, there is a legacy within the mining industry that isn't positive. And that's a legacy that we have to own up to. But it's also important to recognize that whilst a lot of mistakes have made in the past, a lot of change has also happened since then. And there's a couple of items that I would like to pick up on in my remark. And the first one is around transparency. And ICMM and our members are staunch supporters of the work that EITI is doing, and we will support them to the hilt on that. And I think we've shown time and time again from the industry side that this is a matter of great importance to us. So not a very long time ago, ICMM's members committed that all contracts that we either are granted or enter into, contracts or permits given, from the 1st of January 2021 will be made public, which is an important step from the industry to show that we genuinely mean business on transparency. However, this is only a first step, and one step that far too often is forgotten is that whilst industry has a very important role to play in this, fundamentally it comes down to governance, and governance comes down to governments. Often I find when I attend multilateral events such as COP and other negotiations that it's industry that is truly pushing for transparency, and it's governments that often are quite reluctant on publishing the contracts that they are entering into, because corruption risk comes from both sides. And if we are truly meaning business when it comes to resolving corruption, our government partners need to be willing to meet us when it comes to transparency. And on the topic of crime, when it comes to mining, we far too often think about illegal small-scale mining, which is impossible not to address that issue. And it would be really easy for me to sit here and say, representing most of the mining majors of the world, that, well, illegal mining is illegal, so it's just an enforcement problem. But that would be the intellectually very lazy thing to say. Illegal mining happens in many parts of the world because, in all fairness, the other alternatives in terms of livelihood simply do not exist, or is going down other avenues of crime. Which means that in order to resolve these issues that sometimes lead to crime, we need to look at how otherwise can you build sustainable livelihoods in these parts of the world. A very good friend of mine serves as the Belgian consul to parts of the DRC, where there's a major issue with illegal small-scale mining. And we caught up a couple of weeks ago, and he said, John, when it comes to mining in this part of the world, it's either you take your pickaxe and your shovel and you find some cobalt and you'll be able to, in a month, get enough money to feed your entire family for a year, or you leave your ancestral homelands, you move perhaps to Kinshasa, where you might be struggling to find day labor, or end up in either prostitution or other forms of crime. So we need to really have a conversation as a society around how do we actually sustainably address the issues around illegal small-scale mining, and it's a conversation that far too often isn't being had. And one of the ways that you absolutely can start to address this is around standards and making sure that high standards are being implemented within the mining sector. Again, it would be easy for me to say from ICMM side that as long as you have really good stringent standards, we will resolve these issues. Unfortunately, implementing standards can be very costly, not only in terms of compliance, but also certain standards also have a high financial entry point before you can even be part of that standards ecosystem. So standards plays an important role, and whilst the previous speaker has very aptly highlighted some of the challenges that come with the consumer setting requirements on the supply chain, I will still say that there is still a very important role in the supply chain saying that actually we don't accept materials that are not verifiably coming from sources that are sustainable. Because at the moment, there isn't really a huge financial incentive on companies to actually adhere to the higher standards. It costs them a hell of a lot of money. One of our member companies, which I'll remain unnamed, have operations in 4 or 5 countries, supply a lot of copper amongst other materials. For their copper mines alone, they need to implement between 5 and 10 mining standards on top of a full raft of other standards. And this costs a lot of money. This company alone, they're talking about $10, $15 million per year in just, adhering to this fragmented standards landscape. But they're not getting paid more by the consumers for the fact that they are supplying sustainable copper or sustainable iron. And this is, again, a challenge that if we want to stamp out corruption risks, we need to have the governance mechanisms in place where this doesn't happen or where the market disappears. Because at the moment, the market is there. We are not willing to put the sort of the costs that it actually means to mine with principles. And for as long as we're not willing to do that, this problem isn't going to go away. And I'm being very open and honest about this, because this is a conversation that keeps coming up time and time again. And again, eventually it gets a bit frustrating, because yes, the mining sector, we absolutely have our challenges. We're working very hard with civil society, with our consumers, with governments, with other stakeholders, to right the wrongs of the past, because we are very aware of the fact that if there's going to be a just energy transition, we need to have justly mined materials. But we can't do this alone, and also we are a partner here that needs to be in the room, because crime and corruption, it's as harmful as us as to everyone else. We know that operating with high standards is actually more profitable, so that we have a commercial interest on top of what's the right thing to do. So I think I'll leave my remarks at that.
Thank you so much. And indeed, it adds to the complexity of understanding that we are against a timeline, essentially, of the problem becoming worse as the demand increases in pressure if we don't set standards and if we don't deal with the complex situation. But on illegal mining, shall we say, illegal extraction of mining, I would like to just also add that part of the problem is that criminal economies are sometimes set up in that way, so that there is really no alternative. So every other alternative of livelihood is destroyed by criminal organizations, so that's the only livelihood possible. And then they are the ones then doing the negotiation of the prices and all of this. So in that sense, verifying the sources, as you were saying, and setting up standards that allows us to identify where is it coming from is one of the essential elements for this, but also providing sustainable livelihoods. But in doing that, also preventing the capture of economies by criminal organizations, which is what's really happening. Having said that now, I would like to open for questions, if there are any. So please raise your hand if you have any questions. And I see no hands. So unless there's any additional comments from our panelists, I think we can close this event. Yes, please go ahead.
No, thank you so much. That was a really, really, really fantastic panel, and I think we all learned a lot. I hope you can hear me. I was just wondering, I guess more for John, how exactly do you think that government, because I feel like sometimes the conversation kind of remains within the industry, and or these discussions, they happen in parallel. Governments accusing industries of being corrupt in a way, and industries accusing governments of being corrupt. So I'm wondering how can, in a way, industries put more pressure on governments to improve transparency and governance, and I guess just strengthen the collaboration between them. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And I will probably just do a sales pitch for EITI to start off with. So from our perspective, we strongly recommend that all governments, engage or indeed join the efforts of the EITI. In a lot of the conversations I have with governments that perhaps haven't signed up, we always make the plug that this is a very good way to make sure that, from a government perspective, give the incentive to show that you are transparent. And I think that's also a way, the way that I see it. So from industry side, for us to put pressure on governments, we in many ways act as standard bearers and standard carriers. So, if we, as the mining industry, go into a jurisdiction where you might have a weaker regulatory environment or where transparency isn't a requirement, our member companies still have to adhere to these rules because they are set at a global level. And I think by showing civil society that this is a norm and essentially making this normative, you can definitely put additional pressure on governments. And I think this is also where it comes in from the consumer side, that if consumers actually tells governments that this is important, we want to know where our materials that is going into our cell phones, into our EVs, solar panels, you name it, that can also be a very powerful way of putting pressure on governments. But I also think that's the pressure point. I also think it's really important to the degree possible, and this is something that, as you can imagine, I'm facing a lot, that there is a lot of very unnecessary antagonism in a lot of these conversations that we're having around mining, where conversations are quite often pitched, government versus industry versus NGOs. Actually, I think that's I think that's a very unhealthy environment to be in, given the urgency of the issues they were dealing with. But also, I think it harms and hampers effective policy making. So I think being willing to having these difficult conversations with all stakeholders, including governments, is going to be important.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think in addition to, I absolutely agree, I think EITI is a great example of an initiative that attempts to, in a structured way, bring those stakeholders together. And that's one of the reasons we've been interested in exploring, understanding whether the lessons that have been developed on oil, gas and mining could be transferred also to renewable energy actors in the sector more broadly, which to us seems to make a lot of sense, also because of the interconnectedness between the mining sector and the wider renewable energy sector. So let's see where we take that discussion on, based on the call to action that's being launched tomorrow, whether there is a space for opportunity there around looking at a possible expansion of the remit of an initiative like that down the line. But I wanted to just add also that I think, governments are doing quite a lot to regulate this space more tightly. And maybe I could just mention 3 examples that I think are taking us in a positive direction. The European Green Deal and the wide legislative package that comes with that, including, for instance, the Corporate Social Responsibility Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, is a real sort of watershed change moment in terms of the transparency expected of companies around a whole range of topics, but including the topics that we're talking about now. So I think we'll see a trend there in terms of it becoming harder and harder to hide poor practice, and therefore I think that some of the premium that you're talking about around, how do we create a premium for positive, responsible practice, that's obviously a lot easier to do when you can tell the good players apart from the less responsible players, which I think today is quite hard in many cases. There's a lot of sort of greenwashing happening in the reporting from companies. A second example is the extent to which human rights legislation is now being introduced in a number of countries that brings that topic much closer to how compliance has been dealt with on anti-corruption, bribery matters. We have a new law passed a year and a half ago in Norway on transparency around human rights, which means that today, as a company operating out of Norway, anyone, anywhere in the world, can ask us any question about any human rights challenge anywhere in our supply chain or operations, and they need to be given an answer within 3 weeks. And if we don't respond within 3 weeks, we can be fined by the government for doing so. Now you say, well, will that change anything in of itself? I think it will change things, because it forces difficult topics and difficult dilemmas into the public domain. We've had to respond to 4 such requests already in the last 12 months, and that has been, you could say, not everyone in my company would agree that it's been a positive thing, but I think it's been a really positive development in terms of bringing much better discussions into the public domain around practices on the ground. And I think the third example is the regulations developing around transition minerals, critical minerals specifically, which I think will contribute to addressing the problem that you raise around, is there enough of a premium for responsible mining practices? I think that will improve with a tightening of the regulatory space around this. So I think governments are doing quite a lot, but as business we need to play our part in this change.
I just thought I should come in with on that multi-stakeholder point, because I think for people who are, sort of deeply immersed in the extractive industries, I think the EITI approach is a familiar approach, but also conscious that there might be people in the room who are not. But we really, apart from the transparency component of what the EITI requires, the other component of that is that in each country that implements the EITI, there are what we call multi-stakeholder groups, in which governments, companies, and civil society sit together and on an equal footing are responsible for the oversight and governance of the initiative. And that creates a really powerful accountability tool, where in many countries this is one of the few spaces in which civil society is able to really engage with government and engage with companies without a fear of reprisal. And so it opens up an important space for accountability. And I think one of the things that we find is quite interesting is that often the lines of opposition are not what you might expect. Often you might have civil society and companies who are very much more aligned in terms of the types of information they want to see disclosed to the public. And so the divisions are not, it's not always a clear division between, governments and industry versus civil society, or however it might play out. And I was actually just last week in Ghana, where we were doing some work at the very local level of trying to convene some multi-stakeholder dialogues in some mining areas. And it was really interesting to see how much of a demand for information there was from just community members in order to be able to hold both government and companies accountable. What I would say is where there's more work needed is in connecting the dots between the downstream and the upstream. I think there's really interesting work being done by the likes of ICM, EITI. At the mining end of the spectrum, there's interesting work being done by the likes of Statkraft at the downstream end of the spectrum, but connecting those two is really challenging. And I think, as Maya was pointing out, this collaboration that we've been doing together with Statkraft and some other partners and around a call to action for transparency in the renewable sector, which we'll launch tomorrow, is a really important part of that. I think another component, because you mentioned some of the kind of things that governments are doing, we're seeing lots of governments, including the EU, putting in place critical mineral strategies, putting in place initiatives to secure supply of these minerals from other countries. And we really want to see strong recognition and safeguards of the need to tackle corruption and protect human rights in those agreements.
If we've got a moment, I was only going to add that we do work closely with WCO and OECD on a law enforcement network, and that is something that I think is going to go a great part of the way towards giving us more of a structure for the enforcement side. So we are seeing an appetite from the law enforcement community to understand this better.
I'll take the minute. Just one further example, because you jogged my memory, of where industry can also really play a really strong role for good. And it's actually at another COP, it was COP 15 last year for the Convention on Biological Diversity, where as a part of the new agreement, there were a lot of focus on disclosure and transparency. And I was there during the negotiations, and at the 11th hour, governments wanted to water down a lot of the text around disclosure and transparency, and it was actually through Business for Nature, which represented the business community, and through our pressure on governments that we actually managed to make sure that governments couldn't water down commitments on transparency and disclosure. So I think, again, it's important to see that industry can play such an important role also in these multilateral negotiations, alongside other stakeholders, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And before closing, I just want to add, as the UN as well, the UN is actually well placed usually to play this convening role and to ensure that there is a fair discussion, shall we say, between civil society, governments, the governance structure, law enforcement, international organizations. So I think that can help in connecting the dots upstream and downstream. And that's part of the reason we're having this conversation. So with that, I just want to thank you all and for coming to the event and have a good experience the rest of the COP week. Thank you. Bye.